So Tyler, I did go ahead and start the YouTube stream. Still muted, but let me know if that's coming through okay. Yeah, I get that. Where is it coming from? Yeah, I'm hearing it. It's not my TV. Tyler, I think it might be your background. Yeah. Cool. And it looks like I corrected my echo as well. So ready to go. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. Now, there are many ways to secure content in SharePoint, and I'm looking forward to introducing everyone today on how supplementing native security with dynamic security is helping organizations apply levels of compliance that they truly desire without having to reinvent the wheel. So to achieve this goal, here's what we're planning to cover for today. I'll certainly provide a formal introduction of myself shortly, and then I'll share with you a number of scenarios that we've observed in the SharePoint space over the years. I'll outline things that we all wish were possible when implementing security measures and provide a demonstration that includes how achieving these goals may actually be possible today within your existing environments. As we progress through today's session and you have questions that come up, please feel free to ask them. We will be holding a Q&A session at the end of today's presentation, and we'll review questions that you enter into the question box of this webinar. So now to introduce myself, my name is Brenton West. I'm a senior SharePoint security architect here at CryptZone. I've been working with compliance and data loss prevention technology for over a decade now, with hundreds of architectural reviews and implementations that span many different verticals and industries, including healthcare, commercial, federal, state and local government, and even financial institutions. Just a quick personal note to get to know the speaker a little bit better. I reside in southern New Hampshire, and I purchased a home that was built in 1740. So in my off time, you can only imagine there's always plenty of work to be done for maintenance and upkeep, and really bringing this old home up to today's era. So let's get into the discussion that we're focused in on today, though, around dynamically securing SharePoint content easily and quickly. SharePoint is an excellent platform to leverage for collaboration. The problem is there are too many needs across an organization, and it's nearly impossible to keep up with all of the demand. Continuous collaboration requests can quickly complicate compliance policies and security requirements. With data at rest, data in motion, and then hybrid scenarios where SharePoint is on-prem and in the cloud, the quote-unquote perimeter is no longer the office network or office walls. So everyone's always chasing an easier way to allow for secure collaboration without it overburdening IT staff or creating an unusable solution and environment for your employees. It comes down to the balance between ensuring security and enabling collaboration. It can certainly be a challenge to understand which way to swing the fulcrum, especially when taking into consideration various compliance requirements or certifications that need to be maintained. And any security needs to be transparent to the user. And that's really part of the challenge. As this quote from Forrester is referencing, your role is to help foster safe behaviors, control information access, and verify ongoing compliance, all without hampering creativity, productivity, collaboration, or other daily activities. Let's take a look at how SharePoint security is handled in organizations today. For purposes of this discussion, let's think of a SharePoint site that's being used as an organization's intranet. So each department has their own site collections for organizational purposes. Each department needs to keep content amongst themselves while it is being worked on. A marketing team is a great example of a group with this type of scenario. While working on the latest white paper or literature, the marketing team wants to make sure that draft copies are not prematurely sent out or distributed to ensure that all of the context and information is up to date. To make sure that the issues, to make sure that incidental sharing doesn't come up, a number of sites or libraries may be generated on their site. Maybe even permissions are being applied at the library level, or even more granular in breaking inheritance on individual items. all of these really do introduce challenges. Maybe users forget to set or update permissions as different teams are working on them, or without proper training, a marketing individual may inadvertently upload a document to the wrong location. One nice thing is that SharePoint is a platform that does allow for some of these complex collaboration scenarios, and puts these scenarios in reach where companies didn't have the capability to easily provide this to their user base before. Even still, some scenarios can still be challenging. And these three items that we've just highlighted here around juggling permissions, maintaining multiple user groups, or creating unique silos for sharing scenarios aren't the only three ways that security can be taken, but in our experience, these are the three methods that we typically see organizations lean towards in the first attempt for setting some permissions for collaboration environments. Unfortunately, the result of using these methods introduces some methodology that can be hard to manage and maintain, especially as different groups start having more and more requests, and the requests become more complex over time. And it really creates complicated interactions with the site, and maybe introduces the fact that there are some incomplete security gaps with just the default or out-of-the-box solutions. And sometimes the only way to fill those solutions is with complex workflows or external processes that quickly frustrate users, making it so that they may not want to use SharePoint as their core area to collaborate upon. And it can certainly frustrate administrators as well, because with so many colliding and competing requests, it can be very difficult to maintain that environment, as I've mentioned. So what's missing? We think that dynamic security is really an answer to a lot of these issues or problems. So let's start unpacking what we mean by dynamic security. Dynamic security is the ability to apply security as users and documents change in real time, not setting permissions directly to a file or library and making it so that every user who accesses that content receives the same presentation of the file. It's difficult to secure an environment that doesn't have dynamic security because you can't take user context or location into account. This means that it's very difficult to create collaboration and security scenarios where you may want for users to have open access to content while they're at the office, but when they transition to a public location like a coffee shop, an airport, or have traveled internationally, you have no way with today's methodology to understand that user context and update security in real time to ensure that sensitive information maybe isn't accessible when they're outside of the corporate locations. And if content leaves SharePoint, it can be difficult to maintain security. In my experience, if an organization has this type of a concern with content actually leaving SharePoint and the documents being properly secured, they tend to shy away from using SharePoint or limit what content can be stored there. And both of those scenarios thwart collaboration. Furthermore, using information about user and content context is the best way to ensure that content is always properly secured without placing undue burden on employees. The more diverse the use case, the more difficult it is to maintain and ensure ease of use, especially when just default or out-of-the-box security options are used. And that's where dynamic security really can help to assist with that entire process. So let's take a look at some scenarios where dynamic file protection would add security beyond what's native in SharePoint. Here we can see a very common use case, especially with hybrid type environments where there may be a historical SharePoint 2013 installation on-prem that your teams are working to upgrade maybe to 2016. And then you've also started to dabble in Office 365 by enabling SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business. Here we can see that users are located in different areas. One individual is a manager, one's a developer. Both are maybe working outside of the corporate headquarters. And we can see if we follow these lanes that both users are attempting to access the same document. Without leveraging dynamic security, it's very difficult to enable Jane, the manager who's an employee, the rights to edit a file, while only providing Adam, a consultant, the ability to view the content using out-of-the-box and default SharePoint security and functionality. Dynamic security would be able to take into consideration the fact that Jane is outside of headquarters and working from a coffee shop, as well as the fact that Adam is a consultant, and in real time allow both users to access the exact same document, but provide it in a method that ensures that security is maintained properly. Also, protecting files in motion certainly needs to be taken into consideration, and security needs depend on the context and content as it is in SharePoint. When we're talking about content in motion, that could mean that a document may be transitioning from one area of SharePoint into another. It also may mean to your teams that you want to prevent or add security should that document actually leave SharePoint, and even prevent sharing capabilities such as printing or saving copies of it. Again, if we're able to take into consideration the context of the file, regardless of where a user comes from, we would be able to, with dynamic security, set permissions and security the right way for every file, for every user request. We don't have to handle both of these scenarios separately. We are able to take both attributes around users in motion and content in motion. So let's take a look at 3 scenarios and example security policies we might like to apply to continue the conversation and introduce how dynamic security would be beneficial in comparison to native security options. If we start by reviewing an employee that works, in an office on campus, and we're still taking into consideration a hybrid environment where there's cloud resources, content residing in SharePoint Online, and an on-premise instance of SharePoint. Somebody who's located at headquarters and is granted full clearance, you may want to set the security and governance policies to make it so that if this user tries to interact or collaborate with a top secret document, you want them to be able to see it. But if they were to extract that document from Office 365 or SharePoint, then that file needs to be encrypted as soon as it's downloaded. And that can be a very difficult thing to implement with native technologies. Furthermore, if you want to prevent certain projects from being viewed by a particular user or sets of users, that goes back to our marketing department example, where you're having to create multiple libraries, breaking inheritance potentially, setting unique permissions that can be quite taxing when trying to maintain and ensure that permissions are always appropriate as time progresses. Continuing on with a user who has full clearance again, but works on multiple projects, now we need to take where they're located into consideration. So how is it that when a user is interacting with a document labeled as top secret, we can give them a secure view-only presentation of that document without worrying about screenshots being taken or photos being taken of that without some sort of indicator that that was not content to be distributed. And furthermore, because of where they're located, wouldn't it be nice to dynamically understand that and limit their ability to do certain activities, such as stop their ability from printing or copying very sensitive documents because they're in a public location and not at the corporate headquarters? These are all things that are extremely difficult and complex to accomplish with native functionality, and dynamic security would really help a considerable amount. And the same goes on even for our contractor scenario, where contractors maybe should never see top secret documents. And for the few project documents that they are allowed to view across this hybrid environment, we really want to limit their ability to take that information with them, because you only want to grant view access to the contractors. As many of you may be aware, if you were to set native SharePoint permissions on a file that said view only, that does not prevent a user from opening the file in its native format. So maybe a Word document being opened in Office. And when a document is opened in Office without any protections being applied to it, well, they still can take a snippet out of that document or hit the Save As button. And these are all scenarios or items that we would love to apply to an environment, but are extremely difficult to accomplish with native capabilities. With that, in this slide on one side, we can see that we've been focusing in on and talking about users. Users have attributes that we'd like to take into consideration for our policies, such as what type of device are they using? Are they on a mobile device or a corporate laptop? What time of day is it? Is it after office hours or during office hours? Where is this individual physically located? And taking all of those attributes into consideration, we would love to be able to apply some real-time security to files. Furthermore, if we look at file information, it too has a number of attributes that we would love to utilize. Who is the originating author of this file? Where is this document located? And maybe you have some internal processes that help to classify and identify a document, whether it's sensitivity, flagging what project a file is associated with, or other metadata that your business finds useful. Well, we're here to introduce today that obviously we're talking about dynamic security, and Security Sheriff is a solution that allows for these two items, being user attributes and document attributes, can be utilized to apply real-time dynamic security for content in a SharePoint environment. The example that I've pulled up on the screen at this time shows that if a document were labeled as top secret, maybe we want to take some action if the documents are opened on mobile devices, such as the Android platforms or iPhone platforms. And with that, for today, let's take a moment and step away from slides and actually show a real-life example, show an out-of-the-box instance of SharePoint, and talk about how dynamic security can be applied to accomplish a number of the scenarios that we're looking at here today. So for our demonstration, I have a sample Office 365 tenant. This first view of the tenant is a vanilla view of the SharePoint environment. Security Sheriff or dynamic security has not been activated in this view. So when I log in as myself, we can see that there's a variety of documents, about 10 or so. These documents have different levels of classification applied to them. They're also associated with different projects. Some relate to Project A, Project B, and a couple are flagged as all. So in this use case, maybe all employees are allowed to see those documents. And here in this view, we're also showing who these documents were actually created by. So we'll use this exact same library for all of our examples today and show how simple it can be to define dynamic security rules using Security Sheriff and activate them on this sample library. So to properly introduce Security Sheriff, it itself is a SharePoint native solution that does enable the capabilities of dynamic security. We accomplish this by leveraging content attributes, any metadata that may be applied to a file, and we've already reviewed all the options that we'd be leveraging here today, such as the document name, classifications, projects that the content is associated with. Security Sheriff is also able to consume user properties in any of the rules that are created. When defining user properties, there are many identity providers that we're going to be able to leverage. We can certainly use the common ones, so the Active Directory or Azure Active Directory identity providers. We can consume any attribute from those arenas. We can also look at attributes that may be documented in user profile services, let's say. But then we start getting into a couple of scenarios that a default implementation of SharePoint and security wouldn't allow for you to utilize. One of those examples is a lookup list. Maybe you have a list somewhere in SharePoint or even an external database that identifies what projects users are actively working on. And that information hasn't found its way into Active Directory or SharePoint in any way yet, other than residing in a list. Security Sheriff enables you to actually leverage that known information to develop your policies and define real-time dynamic security. Another area that we introduce around user information is the ability to consume the user claim tokens that are created for every individual that logs into SharePoint environments. This means that we can understand where is a user logging into SharePoint from, regardless if we're talking about Office 365 or an on-premise instance. What type of device is that user leveraging? Because again, those may be attributes that we want to understand, as that may change the security and posture of the content that we want to be presenting. As I mentioned when we were looking at the slides, we can use either of these attributes alone for dynamic security, or we can use them together as well. Okay, so the types of rules that we'll be looking at today use both of those. And we'll be focusing in on three types of rules that Security Sheriff offers: dynamic access rules, ribbon rules, and secure document rules. I'll also be using different browser windows to represent different user experiences. So we'll have Diana, who's working from the office. We'll have Jane, who's working from the coffee shop. And we'll have Adam, who's an external contractor and not a named user in our systems. If we start with our Security Sheriff's dynamic access rules, these, in my opinion, are some of the most powerful rules that can be written in a SharePoint environment. I do want to mention that any rule that Security Sheriff is applying to the environment is completely additive to native SharePoint permissions. So a user must still be granted access to the SharePoint site, and then once they have access to that site, Security Sheriff is able to control the level of access or even whether or not documents are visible to users based on the conditions that we're about to review here. So we can see we have some sample rule sets set up for documents that maybe have not been classified yet, documents that have certain clearance levels applied to them, a rule that interrogates what projects a user is working on and what project a document is labeled as, and even default classification dynamic access rules. So if we look at this, our last rule, here's the framework that all of the Security Sheriff rule sets use, and we allow for conditional expressions to be written. As you'll see in any of our rules, we are not defining specific users or user groups. We're simply educating Security Sheriff and leveraging the buckets of information and running conditions or comparisons to see if scenarios match. So what we see here is a conditional expression that looks at the classification of a document, what is the metadata that's physically applied to it. If that classification is greater than the security clearance that a user has defined to them, and that security clearance could have been extracted from Active Directory, SharePoint, or the lookup list as we reviewed. If the clearance is higher than what a user is granted when they log in, we're denying access. And when access is denied with a dynamic access rule, that quite literally means that those documents are not visible to a user. So let's take a look at our different use cases and see how the user interface actually looks. So if we start with, let's just refresh this page. If we start with Diana, who's working as an employee, we can see that Diana is able to see Project A documents, not able to see Project B documents, can see some top secret or lower classified documents, but Diana definitely doesn't have access to all 10 or so documents that were in this environment. We can see that Diana has access to one of the unclassified documents, but that's because Diana was the author of that document that has not been classified yet. As we look at other use cases, I think we'll see that Diana is the only one that can see this unclassified document because she is the author of it. If we transition to somebody who's maybe working at a coffee shop and we want to take into account that Jane does have access to multiple projects, but here we can see that Jane doesn't see any of the unclassified documents that Diana had written. We're only seeing a document that Jane wrote herself that she has not classified yet. And this, of course, continues on to maybe the most restricted view where Adam, who is our contractor, logs into this exact same SharePoint location, but even has a more restricted view, seeing his own document and only a couple of project documents that were granted based on his certification level or what projects he is working on. The really nice thing about this is that the Security Sheriff rules, again, are additive. They can be scoped at the farm level, and if a rule is set at the farm level, anybody at a lower tier of the hierarchy of SharePoint cannot overwrite that rule set. So this means that in our sample document library, nobody has the ability to overwrite a global rule. They can certainly add more restrictions, but they can't write a rule that all of a sudden exposes this sensitive information. Also, the dynamic access rule is preventing access to these documents in 3 specific ways. We've already reviewed in detail the user experience of SharePoint itself. So a user logs into SharePoint, sees the SharePoint content, and we're proactively filtering what files are made available to a user, again, based on how it's classified or attributes of the user themselves. But the dynamic access rule is also filtering search results. So if Adam were to search for Diana's unclassified file, he will never see that file listed in either the library or global search results. And that's because Security Sheriff's dynamic access rules understand the dynamic nature and prevent those files that Adam, our contractor, does not have permissions to from being exposed. The third area that a dynamic access rule is able to set permissions or stop content from being shared is external connection locations. So this means if a user was allowed to connect to Outlook, connect with Office apps, or sync documents, if Adam connects this document library to his workstation, he will only see his own documents being presented. So this is really powerful because no matter what method a user uses trying to get into to access documents, security sheriff's dynamic access rules act as a light switch and make it so that the user is only going to be able to see the files that they are permissioned and granting access to. So dynamic access rules, in my opinion, are some of the most powerful that security sheriff can add to the environments, but they can be a bit too abrupt. Even though we've now shown how a document can be made visible or not visible, or even prohibit searching capabilities, for those items that are visible, you may want to restrict what actions or activities a user can take. For this, in Security Sheriff, we introduce ribbon rules. In this case, I only have one example built out. If a user is working remotely, then we want to disable a certain set of options for that user. In this case, if they're outside of CryptZone's corporate headquarters in Waltham, Massachusetts, then we're going to prevent them from downloading a copy of that document. So let's take a quick look. If we're looking at Jane, who is working from the coffee shop, and Jane attempts to work with a document, regardless of which document it is, our ribbon rule being applied by Security Sheriff knows that Jane is outside of the corporate headquarters and therefore prevents Jane from downloading a copy or sharing this document. Now we could take into consideration other attributes like what type of device is Jane using, and maybe if they're on a corporate device opposed to a mobile device, these documents could be downloaded. But just for today's demonstration, we've kept it fairly simple and said anybody that's outside of corporate headquarters can't download documents. This is also being applied to the conditional menu of a file. So even when I right click on a file, I cannot hit the download a copy button. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, okay, that's great. We've prevented options from being made available inside of SharePoint, but what if this user's actually editing the document and has started collaborating on the content? Well, that's where Security Sheriff's secure document rules come into play. We introduce two options when securing the collaboration sessions of content. One of those options would be to present the file in a zero footprint secure reader. This makes it so that nothing is allowed to be brought down to the workstation or device, and that document is only rendered in the browser. So let's take a look at that example. When Jane goes and tries to open this document, it does not send the document to Office web apps or Word on their workstation. Instead, it opens the document like a picture in the browser itself as a pop-up document. This document they cannot copy snippets out of. Obviously there's watermarking being applied. Here we only expose the time, the date, and the classification of the document, but we could have certainly also added some dynamic attributes. Who opened it? At what time, from what location, so that if somebody did take their phone out and take a picture, well, it's pretty evident at what point that information was viewed. Certainly in the background, Security Sheriff is also collecting user information and content information in order to help facilitate audit logs, for example. Another secure document rule allows for you to activate Microsoft RMS rules in real time per item. And this makes it so that when a user actually does go and edit that document, they're allowed to edit it, they're allowed to save it back to SharePoint, but it prevents them from hitting the Save As button so that a copy of that document resides on their desktop indefinitely. You can even add time bombs to the content that leaves SharePoint, making it so that that document is only available for a certain period of time. And after that period of time elapses, the document itself renders itself useless through RMS encryption, and users must come back to the central location, in this case, the SharePoint environment, for another version of that document, or more importantly, the most current and latest version. To show the user experience when a user does open a document that is RMS protected, I'll go ahead and just start opening this document. You'll see that in real time, Security Sheriff is applying RMS rules to this document as it's being brought to my workstation. So let me just go ahead and log in as the right user. There we go. You'll see a quick pop-up window letting us know that rights management is being applied to this file. And now we're being fed a protected view of this document. So even though my SharePoint permissions could have been view-only access, Security Sheriff really helped to take things to the next level. And in this case, we only granted view access. This means that if I attempt to edit this document, I will not be able to do so. If I try to copy information out of it, RMS security is native to Microsoft and other RMS enlightened technologies. So it will gray out those options by default for you. This user cannot save or share or print the document because they were only granted view access. Even if they did have screen snippet technology, in this case, this technology is RMS enlightened, and therefore that document is prevented from being screen clipped. And just to show you the power of using Microsoft RMS to facilitate this level of security, if I do start attempt to edit this document in the GoToWebinar, you should only see a black box at this time where we had our Word document. And that is because GoToWebinar is RMS enlightened, and therefore you're unable to see the sensitive document that I have on my workstation. And that's true for many other solutions such as Skype as well. Okay. So combining, certainly using any of these rules alone by themselves introduces some really interesting scenarios that help to enhance security in a SharePoint environment. But then when used together, it helps you to ensure that regardless of what user is attempting to access and work with content, that they're only ever viewing the right version of a document and only granted the appropriate permissions. Okay. And if we take these different pieces of functionality that Security Sheriff can introduce to an environment and actually go above and beyond the basic examples that we've introduced today and start looking at compliance issues like ITAR compliance. For those who may not be familiar with ITAR, that's around weapons controls. And you need to take into consideration things like what country is an individual from. And that may have a bearing on whether or not certain documents should be visible to them or not. So using a dynamic access rule for somebody who's fully clearanced and at headquarters, maybe they're allowed to see that document. So the dynamic access rule will allow for that document to be visible in SharePoint or the external connection points. But when they actually are working with the content in SharePoint, they can't hit the download button. And when they are editing the document, it is being protected when that file is extracted out of SharePoint and brought down to the user's workstation. Continuing on with the same type of ITAR compliance and these Security Sheriff policies, somebody who is working then from a coffee shop may still be able to see a document, but have many more restrictions being applied all the way down to only showing that document in its zero footprint reading presentation with watermarks applied all over it so that that content cannot be shared or extracted. And of course, we want to ensure that low credentialed users, in our use case, the contractor, just should not ever be able to see these ITAR documents because that's not part of their business unit or needs. So again, Microsoft solutions are a great start and can accommodate many use cases, but we need to do a couple of things and maybe enhance those environments to ensure that we're going beyond just those native security features that are made available to us. And that's where dynamic security and security sheriff really can help out. For example, extending SharePoint and Azure permissions by evaluating information about the documents and users in real time. All of this while we are not altering the permissions that are set in SharePoint. It's truly an additive layer, making it very easy to implement, deploy, and as you've even seen it for the users, at the end of the day, they're just simply using a SharePoint site. For the scenarios where you want to ensure that when content is extracted from SharePoint and ensuring that it is protected properly still, being able to restrict what the users can maybe search for or what they can do with that document while it's out of the SharePoint environment is important. And then, as I did mention earlier, maintain a centralized audit trail for each document and user for any of your auditing requirements. So as you've seen today, Security Sheriff is a SharePoint native application that enables organizations to set enterprise-grade security and compliance without re-architecting their farm or tenant. I focused on the functionality that Security Sheriff offers when it comes to collaboration at the middle of the slide here. Security Sheriff can also help organizations with the classification of content and administrative requirements, such as user tracking and logging for easier audits. For those of you who are interested in those additional features that Security Sheriff introduces, please be sure to contact us after today's session for additional information. Just a bit more about CryptZone. As I mentioned, we're located just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. Certainly a number of accolades for our products. Today, we've focused in on one of the three products which CryptZone offers, and that was the middle product listed here in around data security specific to SharePoint and Office 365. And as you've seen, the solution that we offer is called Security Sheriff. Other products that we offer include secure access and software-defined perimeter solution that's called AppGate. Takes the same type of dynamic security approaches as we've just reviewed, but applies them all at a network layer opposed to a file or document layer. And last but not least, we also have solutions to assist with web compliance, enabling organizations to test public-facing web properties and ensure that they're compliant against a number of different compliance standards. More resources can always be found on our website at cryptzone.com, where you can find case studies, white papers, and blog postings. Certainly be sure to follow us on Twitter as well. But at this time, I would like to try to answer as many questions that may have come up through the question panel for today's webinar. So bear with me as I open that up and see if anything came in. Looks like a handful did have. Great. So one of the first questions, can a user that knows PowerShell get around all these permissions? Or does the product work down to that level of the SharePoint stack? You'll be happy to learn that Security Sheriff works down to that level of the SharePoint stack. Security Sheriff is able to filter requests that enter the SharePoint environment opposed to native search or indexing functionality or even other solutions that perform their filters after the SharePoint has already correlated or organized all the information that's being sent back to the users. So therefore, we're able to intercept PowerShell commands that are trying to gather details about content and ensure that, in the case of a dynamic access rule, if a SharePoint administrator is not supposed to see or access documents that are labeled as top secret, they will not be able to see or find any of those top secret documents. So great question. Another was, does your solution break search? Well, we certainly hope not. Our solution is intended to enhance search. And that's by allowing for rules such as our dynamic rules to enhance your policies within search, making it so that if a corporate policy is that only a certain set of users should be able to see or access sensitive documents, that not only is that true in native SharePoint users, SharePoint experiences, but also in the search results. So if the policy is deployed that top secret document should not be visible, then that's going to be applied to search as well. So hopefully that helps to answer that question. Just looking at a few other questions that we have. Let's see here. Is the solution good for small and medium sizes of a SharePoint environment? The answer there is yes. As you've seen, policies can easily be defined out. And when policies are defined, we can take rather broad brushstrokes that can assist with security scenarios for organizations that are both large and small. As Security Sheriff is truly a SharePoint native application, it is very straightforward to install. As it's installing basically SharePoint WSPs when you're installing to the SharePoint on-prem and using other methods for connecting to cloud environments. Let's see here. How fast is the solution? Do users get frustrated waiting for policies to be deployed out? Great question, and the answer is no. Everything that we've reviewed and discussed really happens in as near real time as is possible. And let me show you a quick example of that. One of the rules that we looked at was a ribbon rule that prevented users from being able to download documents, right? So let me just go ahead and deactivate that rule and show you how quickly it takes effect to the SharePoint environment itself. So I'll deactivate our ribbon rule, save that rule, and then open up the user who was working from a coffee shop who could not download a copy of a document before. Just simply hit the refresh button, and we'll be able to see that when I do select the same document, I now am able to download a copy, as well as in the contextual menu. So these rules really happen in as real time as is possible, making it a very quick solution to implement for any environment. Now, just to make sure that any of my coworkers who are also using the same demonstration environment don't get flustered, let me just turn that rule right back on. Do a little cleanup. Great. Let's see here. Another question that was asked: how to manage hundreds of site collections and thousands of sites with these dynamic rules? It seems they need to be configured per site collection. That's a great question, and they do not. We certainly have the ability to configure rules per site or site collection, but you can set rules at a more global level, setting a rule for the entire farm, for specific web apps, making it so that those rules are scoped to the appropriate levels. Let me see if I can find a quick spot that actually shows how a rule can be scoped. So all of the rules that we have been reviewing for today were scoped to a specific site. But if I were logged in as a more administrative user, then I would be granted the option to extend the scope of this policy above and beyond just this particular site, but maybe at the farm level. And therefore, these dynamic policies could be written to say any document across the entire SharePoint environment or tenant that is labeled as top secret needs to have certain security applied to it. So you certainly have the capability to deploy global rules. And because we're referencing the buckets that are associated with users or documents, that rule set could be applicable for many different departments or areas of the SharePoint environment. So one simple rule is extremely flexible and diverse. Going down the list, let me see if I can find one or two more questions. And certainly if anyone else has more questions, please feel free to ask. Does this work with access from a mobile device? Yes. And furthermore, because for the collaboration capabilities, as we've reviewed, Security Sheriff is consuming Microsoft RMS. This means that users don't have to download extra clients or extra software in order to view the protected version of these documents. RMS is built into many applications, obviously the entire Office suite, including Office web apps. So if I went and opened that sample document on my cell phone, I would be given the same permissions that we saw on the workstation, even on my mobile device, that I was only granted view access. I couldn't take any screenshots. I couldn't save the document or make copies of it. So the short answer is yes. Everything that we've reviewed here is quite agnostic to mobile devices as well. Let's see here. Another question that just came in, does Security Sheriff work even without RMS? Yeah, thank you for asking that. It does. So the only time that Security Sheriff leverages Microsoft RMS would be if you want to control the collaboration of a document. So when you actually open that file in Word or in a PDF reader, and you want to ensure that inside of that reader or application, a user can't hit the Save As button or hit the Print button. All those areas outside of the SharePoint environment that require protection, that is where Security Sheriff does leverage RMS, and Security Sheriff can leverage either Active Directory or Azure RMS. So very flexible there. Everything else that we've seen does not utilize RMS. It's native functionality that Security Sheriff enhances a SharePoint environment with. So the dynamic access rule that's introducing the light switch, should this document be visible or not, should you be allowed to see it, all the way down to the ribbon rules as well. Another question would be that I'm seeing is around what versions of SharePoint does Security Sheriff support? Security Sheriff can be deployed to legacy SharePoint installs, such as SharePoint 2010, 2013, but then more current versions like SharePoint 2016, as well as Office 365, which certainly covers SharePoint Online as well as OneDrive silos. Quick question coming in around ITAR compliance. Let me just read through this. ITAR compliance is not achievable within Office 365 because of back-end requirements. Interesting. Well, for the individual who wrote that in, definitely would welcome the opportunity to speak with you further. In our experience, we believe at least that Security Sheriff and the dynamic access rules do allow for ITAR compliance. As we even allow for documents to be encrypted while they're at rest inside of the environment. But would love to learn more about your insight around ITAR compliance after today's session. Another question. Can I delegate setting up policies to different work groups, but then maintain master controls if anybody creates, let's say, a bad policy? Absolutely. Security Sheriff was designed to allow for the separation of duties, which is difficult to accomplish in SharePoint natively. So a Security Sheriff rule can be defined by any individual that has administrator rights over the site or library. So certainly a SharePoint administrator could have maybe global rights, whereas a site collection administrator would only be allowed to create rules and policies on the content or areas of SharePoint that they are responsible for overseeing. And that can be very beneficial. So instead of adding many tasks to the already overburdened IT manager or SharePoint administrator, this empowers your site administrators to actually go and create rules on the content that they know the most about and the users that they understand the most. So that separation of duties certainly can be helpful. Okay. Well, it looks like the questions are winding down a little bit. So I thank everybody for the time today. The questions have been great. Certainly, if anybody would like to learn more about the solutions we've discussed in Security Sheriff, I'm more than happy to have an offline conversation to answer anything else that wasn't touched on during our overview today. So with that, I'll sign off. Again, my name is Brenton West. It's been a pleasure speaking with you all today, and look forward to talking to you in the near future. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.